A white officer stops a black judge at the courthouse. But what unfolds next is beyond belief. Leah Marshall was running late again. She pulled up in front of the New Orleans courthouse, her heart racing as she glanced at the dashboard clock. 10 minutes. Just 10 minutes until the trial of her career was set to begin. A mix of nerves and determination coursed through her veins. This wasn't just any trial. It was a pivotal case that could forever reshape how racial profiling was handled in Louisiana. As Leah stepped out of her car, she paused, inhaling deeply. The humid morning air clung to her skin, a heavy reminder of the battles she faced every day, not just as a judge, but as a black woman in a world that scrutinized her every move. Today's weight felt heavier than usual. This wasn't just a case. It was personal. Kevin Daniels, a young black man, had been arrested in his own neighborhood on nothing more than a vague claim. He fit the description. The familiarity of that phrase stung. It echoed too closely to her own experiences. Her heels clicked with precision as she strode across the parking lot. Instead of taking the grand courthouse steps swarmed with reporters, their cameras poised like hawks, she opted for the quieter side door. She didn't have time for the media frenzy. Yet as she approached the side entrance, her path was blocked by a young white police officer. His posture was rigid, his eyes sharp as they followed her every movement. Leah instinctively reached for the ID badge hanging around her neck, a gesture so routine it was muscle memory. But before she could even present it, his hand shot out to stop her. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification," he said, his tone as crisp as the starch in his uniform. Leah blinked, caught off guard. "I'm Judge Marshall," she replied, lifting her badge higher so there could be no mistake. "I'm presiding over the Daniels case this morning." His cold, calculating gaze swept over her, lingering just long enough to make her skin prickle. "There's been an incident nearby," he said, ignoring the badge entirely. "You match the description of someone involved. I'm going to need you to answer a few questions." Leah froze, the irony suffocating. Here she was moments away from presiding over a trial on racial profiling, only to be racially profiled herself. At the courthouse doors, her pulse quickened, anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. "Officer," she began, her voice steady, "I don't have time for this. The trial starts in less than 10 minutes, and I need to get inside." But the officer wasn't budging. His hand hovered dangerously close to the cuffs at his belt. "I don't care who you say you are, ma'am. You're going to need to come with me." The tension crackled in the air. Leah's breath hitched, her instincts screaming that this was escalating too quickly. Just as she opened her mouth to respond, another voice cut through the moment like a knife. "What's going on here?" Leah turned to see an older black officer striding toward them, his face etched with surprise and concern. Relief washed over her as he recognized her. "Judge Marshall," he said, incredulous. "Yes," Leah replied, her voice tight with restrained emotion. The older officer shot the younger one a sharp look. "Stand down," he barked. "That's the judge. She matches the description," the younger officer began, but the older one silenced him with a glare. "That's the judge," he repeated, his voice low and firm. "Do you want to lose your job?" The younger officer's resolve crumbled as he stepped back, muttering something under his breath. Leah forced herself to remain composed, even as anger and humiliation warred within her. She nodded curtly to the older officer, her jaw clenched. "I'm fine. Thank you." Without another word, she walked into the courthouse, her heels echoing in the sterile halls that greeted her like old, indifferent friends. But inside, her mind churned. The scene outside replayed in vivid detail. She'd faced racism her entire life, but for it to rear its head here, on this day, was almost too much to bear. As she banged her gavel to bring the courtroom to order, the irony weighed heavy on her. The trial was underway, yet her own experience felt like a prelude to the story unfolding before her. Kevin Daniels' testimony was raw, every word a stark reminder of the world they lived in. And then came the moment that made Leah's breath catch in her throat. The young officer from earlier walked into the courtroom, his face pale as he approached the stand. Leah's grip on her gavel tightened as she fought to maintain her composure. But one thought consumed her. Justice wasn't just on trial today. It was in the air, in every glance and every word exchanged. And it demanded to be served. Glancing around to ensure they were alone, Harris leaned in, his voice low and earnest. I wanted to talk to you about what happened earlier. With Wilkins. He's not a bad kid, you know, but he's got blind spots, like so many of them do. Leah met his gaze, her expression an unreadable mask. Blind spots? She repeated, her voice laced with a bitterness that cut through the quiet. You mean racism? Harris winced, the word hitting him like a blow he couldn't dodge. He hesitated but didn't argue. Maybe probably. But I want you to know, I'm trying to fix it, from the inside. Leah studied him, her eyes searching for something, truth, conviction, maybe even hope. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that change could happen. But after everything she'd seen, everything she'd endured, that hope felt more like a fragile thread, frayed and close to snapping. What do you suggest I do? She asked softly, her voice steady but weary. When I sit here day after day hearing cases like this, knowing what I've experienced firsthand. Harris was silent for a long moment, the weight of her question hanging heavy in the air. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. You keep doing what you're doing, Judge. You keep holding people accountable. That's the only way things are going to change. Leah nodded slowly, the enormity of her responsibilities pressing down on her like a physical weight. The trial wasn't over. There were more battles ahead, more fights to face. But for today at least she had taken a step forward. As Harris left the room, Leah glanced around the now empty courtroom. The silence was deafening, yet it carried a sense of resolution. The fight was far from over, she knew that. But today justice had been served, and that she thought was a start. The following morning, anticipation hung thick in the courthouse air, as tangible as the hum of the fluorescent lights. The jury had deliberated all night, and today would bring their decision. Leah Marshall sat in her chambers, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She stared at the files spread across her desk, their contents a reminder of the case's stakes. This wasn't just about one man's wrongful arrest. This trial had grown into something far larger, an examination of justice itself, and the biases deeply woven into its fabric. Outside, the muffled din of reporters and protesters gathered on the courthouse steps reached her ears. It was no longer a local story. It had become a national flashpoint. Her thoughts drifted to the previous day, to Officer Bill Wilkins. He had sat in that courtroom, his testimony faltering under the weight of scrutiny. His voice had cracked, his composure crumbled, and for the first time, Leah had seen not just an officer defending his actions, but a man reckoning with the flaws of the institution he represented. A sharp knock on the door jolted her from her thoughts. Come in, she said, her voice steady, though her heart raced. Her clerk, Emily, stepped in, a folder clutched in her hands. The jury's ready, she said softly. Leah nodded, rising from her chair with deliberate calm. She smoothed her robe and exhaled slowly. Let's do this. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Leah entered, the weight of 100 eyes falling on her. Reporters sat poised, pens in hand, cameras ready. Families from both sides, the defendant, Kevin Daniels, and Officer Wilkins, occupied the front rows, their faces mirrors of hope and dread. Taking her place at the bench, Leah's gaze briefly met Kevin Daniels. His expression was solemn, yet a flicker of hope shone in his eyes. She turned to Wilkins. The once confident officer now seemed diminished, his eyes darting nervously. For the first time, he looked small, a man who could no longer deny the consequences of his actions. Please bring in the jury, Leah commanded, her voice ringing out in the stifling quiet. The jurors filed in, their faces unreadable, their steps measured. The forewoman, a middle-aged woman with a tight bun, clutched a slip of paper, her hands trembling slightly. Has the jury reached a verdict? Leah asked, her tone even. The forewoman rose, her voice quivering. We have, Your Honor. Please read the verdict. The room held its breath as she unfolded the paper, her voice gaining strength with each word. In the case of Officer Bill Wilkins, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of wrongful arrest and racial discrimination. A ripple of reaction swept through the courtroom. Leah's eyes flicked to Kevin Daniels, who sat motionless, his expression a mix of shock and relief. Slowly, tears welled in his eyes as his lawyer placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Across the room, Wilkins sat frozen, his face pale, his hands gripping the table as though bracing himself against an unseen tide. Leah banged her gavel once. Court is adjourned. As the room stirred with activity, Wilkins suddenly stood. Your Honor, he called out, his voice raw with emotion. Leah paused, her gaze fixed on him. The courtroom stilled once more. I need to say, he faltered, his words catching in his throat. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting the community, but I was wrong. His voice broke, thick with regret. I see now that my assumptions, my prejudices, clouded my judgment. And I'm sorry. The room was silent, the weight of his words heavy in the air. Leah's eyes narrowed, her voice steady and unyielding. Your apology is noted, Officer Wilkins. But understand this, your actions caused harm that runs deep. Families, communities, entire lives have been affected. A simple sorry doesn't fix that. Wilkins nodded, his shoulders sagging under the burden of her words. He said no more as he waited to be escorted out, the verdict marking the end of one chapter in his life, and the start of a long reckoning. Leah remained seated, watching as Kevin Daniels embraced his family. Relief and exhaustion etched across his face. He was one of the few to find justice. But for every Kevin Leah knew, there were countless others whose voices were silenced, their cases never seen, their pain never acknowledged. As the room emptied, Sergeant Michael Harris approached her, his face a mix of solemnity and hope. Judge Marshall, he began softly. Thank you. For what? Leah asked, her brow furrowed. For holding us accountable, Harris said. We need that. The system needs that. Leah leaned back, exhaling slowly. It doesn't feel like enough. Harris nodded. It's not. But every step matters. Every case like this chips away at the bigger problem. Piece by piece. The words echoed in her mind as she nodded slowly. The fight far from over, but the resolve burning brighter than ever. Leah sat in the now empty courtroom, her chair a cold reminder of the battle that had just unfolded. The echoes of the verdict still reverberated in the air, yet the silence that enveloped her was deafening. The fight wasn't over, she thought. No, it never would be. But today they had taken a step forward. Just one step. Was that enough? Could one victory in a single trial really change anything? She let out a breath, her gaze fixed on the empty seat across from her. It felt like the weight of 1,000 untold stories sat with her. But maybe this was how change began. One small step. As the courtroom emptied, the lingering tension in the air seemed almost tangible. Leah Marshall remained seated, her fingers pressed against the wood of the bench, her mind buzzing with the impact of what had just transpired. But this wasn't a moment for triumph. No, the trial was over, but its reverberations? They were just beginning. The real work, the hard work, was still ahead. This was not the end, not by a long shot. The fight for justice, for true justice, stretched far beyond these walls, beyond this courthouse. It bled into the communities still battling the same systemic issues that had brought Kevin Daniels here in the first place. Kevin Daniels, the man whose life had been forever altered by a system that didn't care for people like him. But Leah had given him a voice. Or had she? She wasn't so sure anymore. She rose from her seat, gathering her papers, when a familiar voice broke through her thoughts. Judge Marshall, Kevin Daniels called, approaching her slowly, his face calm now, though it bore the exhaustion of the past few days. I just wanted to say thank you for everything. Leah paused. For a moment, she simply looked at him, absorbing his words. Thank you? She couldn't let herself dwell on that, not now. You don't need to thank me, Kevin, she said softly, her voice steady but weary. I was just doing my job. Kevin shook his head, a quiet determination in his eyes. No, it's more than that, he insisted. This trial, it wasn't just about me. It was about showing people what really happens out there, what we go through every day. You gave me a voice. Leah's chest tightened, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She nodded slowly, her throat tight with emotion. She wanted to believe in the power of this moment, wanted to believe that things could change. I hope this is a step toward change, she said, choosing her words carefully. But it's just one case. We still have a long way to go. Kevin's expression softened with understanding. I know, but it's a start. And for that, I'm grateful. Leah watched as Kevin turned, his attorney following closely behind. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was so much more left to be done. One trial, one verdict, was never going to be enough to dismantle a system that had been built over centuries. But Kevin was right. It was a start. A small one. She sighed, her shoulders heavy, and began to make her way to her chambers, each step deliberate and slow. The media had already gathered by the front entrance, eager to seize any soundbite or image. Leah didn't need that, not now. She opted to exit through the side door, hoping to avoid the cameras and microphones that would inevitably be thrust into her face. But as she pushed the door open, she froze. There he was, Officer Bill Wilkins. He stood there leaning against the building, his face pale, his posture slumped. His uniform seemed too large for him now, as if the weight of the trial had made him shrink. Leah's heart thudded painfully in her chest. The air between them thickened with unspoken words, a heavy mixture of guilt, anger, and confusion swirling in the space between them. Judge Marshall. Bill's voice was hoarse as he straightened up, his eyes locking with hers. I didn't expect to see you here. Leah didn't respond immediately. What could he possibly say that would change anything? But she allowed him the silence, waiting. I've been thinking, Bill began, his words measured and slow. About everything. About what happened in there. And about what I did to you. His hands fidgeted nervously at his sides. I know saying sorry isn't enough. It won't fix what I did. But I need you to know. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Leah's eyes narrowed. She'd heard this before. This exact same apology. How many times had she heard this from others? Too many. You didn't mean for it to happen, she repeated, her voice cold, cutting through the air. It happened, Officer Wilkins. And it keeps happening. To people like Kevin. To people like me. So forgive me if I'm not moved by your remorse right now. Bill winced, but he didn't back down. I know I screwed up, he said, his voice low. I know I let my biases take over. And I'm trying to understand that now. But it's not as simple as just unlearning everything overnight. I've been taught to see things a certain way. And I didn't question it until now. Leah crossed her arms, her gaze still unyielding. What changed now? Her words cut the air. The fact that you got caught. Or the fact that someone finally called you out on it. Bill didn't have an answer. He just stood there, silently contemplating her words. Leah could feel the weight of the question hanging in the air, just as heavy as the silence between them. Her eyes softened just slightly. What happens to officers like you? She asked quietly, the words slipping from her mouth almost without thought. Ones who were taught to think a certain way. Bill sighed a deep, painful breath. It's hard, he admitted, his voice thick with the struggle of it. There are a lot of guys like me. But there are also people like me, trying to change things from the inside. And I'll keep doing that as long as I can. Leah looked at him, her gaze weighing him. She saw the weariness in his eyes. But there was something more there too. Determination. It was the same determination she felt, despite all the setbacks, despite the exhaustion that hung over them both. Change was possible. It had to be. You keep doing what you're doing, she said, her voice steady. That's how we change this. Piece by piece. Piece by piece, she echoed almost to herself, as Bill turned and walked away. Leah sat back in her chair, once again alone, staring at the empty courtroom. The echoes of the verdict still hung in the air. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But today, they had taken one step forward.